My name is Dr. Elena Marsh, and I am 33 years old. 6 years ago, on the day I graduated from medical school, there were 2 empty seats in the 4th row of a 2,000-seat auditorium at the University of Tennessee. They had names printed on little laminated cards clipped to the seatbacks, because the school did that for every graduate's reserved guest seating. One card said Walter Marsh. The other said Linda Marsh. Neither of my parents ever sat in those chairs. They were 400 miles away in a stadium parking lot outside Indianapolis, standing behind a chain-link fence with 300 other parents, watching my younger brother Jake run a 40-yard dash at a regional NFL combined tryout, because a scout had called 2 weeks earlier and told my father, in a voice my father would later describe to me as the most important phone call of Jake's life, that Jake had been invited to run in front of actual professional scouts. I found out where they were from a text message. My mother sent it to me at 9:47 that morning, 20 minutes before I was scheduled to line up backstage in a purple gown that made me feel, for the first time in 6 exhausting years, like I had actually become the thing I set out to become. The text read, "Sweetheart, we are so sorry. This combine thing came up so fast, and you know what this could mean for Jake's whole future. We know you understand. We'll celebrate with you soon, I promise. So proud of you, Purple Heart, I want you to notice something in that message, because it took me years to fully name it. She was proud of me in the same sentence she was choosing not to watch it happen. Before I take you into the 6 years that followed that morning, if you're new to this channel, go ahead and hit subscribe, because these stories are for anyone who has ever had to learn to clap for themselves in an empty row. And if you've been here before, drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and on nights when the story felt too close to my own chest to keep writing, those comments are what got me to the end of the page. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because you need the full 26 years to understand why I didn't cry when I read that text message, standing backstage in a gown, alone, while 2,000 other families filled a room I'd worked 6 years to stand in. Part 1. The Understudy. I grew up in Pinewood, Tennessee, a town small enough that the volunteer fire department doubled as the youth football coaching staff every August. My father, Walter Marsh, had played high school football himself, decent enough to get a mention in the county paper twice, but not decent enough to go further, and he carried that almost feeling with him the rest of his life the way some men carry an old shoulder injury, mostly invisible, except on certain nights, when it ached in ways he didn't quite know how to explain. My mother, Linda, worked the front desk at Pinewood's only dental practice and ran the concession stand at every home football game with a kind of ferocious, joyful precision that the entire town admired. I was born first. Jake came 3 years later, in a delivery room my father reportedly waited outside of pacing, because he'd wanted a son the whole time, a fact my mother told me once, casually, when I was 19, the way you'd mention what the weather had been like on some ordinary Tuesday. I don't say this to paint my father as a villain. He loved me. I believe that completely, even now. But there is a particular kind of love that gets rationed unevenly without anyone in the house ever admitting the rationing is happening, and I grew up on the smaller portion. By the time Jake was 6, it was clear he had something rare, not just enthusiasm, actual, undeniable athletic gift, the kind scouts start murmuring about before a kid's even old enough to understand what a scout is. My father built a batting cage in our backyard when Jake was 8, then converted half of it into a passing net when Jake switched focus to football at 11. I remember watching my father spend an entire Saturday afternoon installing that net, sweating through his shirt, humming under his breath, happier than I'd seen him in months. I was 13 that year, and I just won my school's regional science fair with a project on antibiotic resistance that my biology teacher told me privately was genuinely graduate-level work for an 8th grader. I brought the ribbon home and set it on the kitchen counter. It sat there for 2 days before my mother moved it to make room for a stack of Jake's youth league schedules, and after that I never saw it again. I didn't ask where it went. Some part of me already understood the answer wouldn't matter.
I want to be honest about something, because I think it's important for anyone listening who grew up in a house like mine. I don't think my parents ever consciously decided I mattered less. I think they simply had more practice celebrating loud things, and I was, by nature, a quiet one. Jake's wins came with crowds and cheering and a scoreboard everyone in town could see. Mine came in the form of a report card, a lab result, a competition 3 counties over that nobody but me and my teacher ever attended. It is very easy, in a house like that, for love to follow volume instead of value, and nobody involved ever has to feel like a bad person while it happens.
Still,
By the time I was 16, I'd stopped bringing home my report cards for anyone to see. I'd open them alone in my room, feel whatever I needed to feel privately, and file them in a drawer. It's a strange kind of self-sufficiency to develop as a teenager. Useful eventually, but strange and a little lonely, in a way I don't think fully healed until I was well into my 30s. There's one memory from that stretch of childhood I've never told anyone outside of Marcus, and I want to tell it here, because it's the clearest snapshot I have of the shape our whole family took. I was 15. I'd spent 4 months building an independent research project on water contamination in 3 local creeks for a state-level science symposium, testing samples myself after school with equipment my chemistry teacher let me borrow, biking to 3 different creek beds every week with a cooler strapped to my handlebars. I placed second in the entire state. Second, out of hundreds of students, many of them from magnet schools with real laboratories. My chemistry teacher called my house personally to tell my mother because she said she wanted to make sure the news actually reached someone. My mother thanked her politely, hung up the phone, and then asked me, almost as an afterthought while she folded laundry at the kitchen table, if I could drive Jake to his Tuesday evening football conditioning session that week, because my father had a work conflict. I said yes, the way I always said yes, and I drove my 12-year-old brother to conditioning drills in near silence, my state symposium ribbon still folded up in the bottom of my backpack, unmentioned, because nobody in the car that evening had asked to see it, and I'd stopped, somewhere around that age, offering things nobody asked for. I got into a competitive pre-med program at the University of Tennessee on a partial academic scholarship. My parents drove me to campus. I'll give them that, but the drive was quiet, mostly filled with my father's phone calls to a recruiting coordinator about Jake's upcoming junior varsity season, which had started that same week. They helped me carry 2 boxes into my dorm, hugged me goodbye, and left within the hour because Jake had a scrimmage that evening they didn't want to miss, even though it was, by any real measure, a meaningless preseason scrimmage against a team from 2 counties over. I worked through undergrad the way I imagine a lot of quiet, overlooked kids do, relentlessly, privately, without much fanfare, because the fanfare had simply never been mine to expect. I waited tables at a diner near campus 3 nights a week. I tutored organic chemistry on weekends. I got into medical school on my first application cycle, which my advisor told me was almost unheard of for someone juggling that much outside work alongside a full course load. I called my mother to tell her. She said, "That's wonderful, honey. Hey, did I mention Jake got moved up to varsity starting quarterback? Coach says he might get looked at by some Division I programs next year." I said congratulations, and I meant it because I did love my brother, in the complicated way you love someone you've spent your whole childhood being quietly compared to. And then I hung up and sat with that same familiar, quiet pressure drop feeling in my chest, the one I'd know intimately by the time I was 30. Part 2. The long 6 years. Medical school nearly broke me. In the ordinary way, it nearly breaks everyone who goes through it. Except I went through it with almost no family calling to check in, because during those exact 4 years, Jake's football career hit its steepest, most attention-consuming climb. He'd earned a scholarship to a mid-major program, then transferred up to a bigger conference school after a breakout sophomore season, and my parents' entire emotional calendar reorganized itself around his Saturday game schedule. I remember calling home during my second year, exhausted after a 30-hour hospital rotation, needing, honestly, just to hear a familiar voice for 5 minutes, and my mother picking up breathless mid-tailgate saying, "Can I call you back, honey? Kickoff's in 10 minutes, and never actually calling back that week. I want to tell you honestly what those years of medical training actually felt like from the inside, because I think the "she pushed through and became a doctor" version of this story skips past the part that shaped who I actually became. Medical school is grueling for everyone, but it is a very particular kind of grueling when you're doing it with almost no one at home tracking your progress. I remember my first anatomy practical, the exam where you have to identify structures on an actual cadaver under timed pressure, sitting in my car afterward in the parking garage shaking slightly from adrenaline, wanting badly to call someone and just say, "I did it, I actually did it," and scrolling through my contacts before realizing the person I most wanted to call was a classmate I'd known for 8 months, because she was more available, in every sense, than my own mother 400 miles away watching Jake's tape from Friday's game for the 3rd time. I remember the week of my board exams, the single most academically important week of my entire education up to that point, and calling home the night before to hear a familiar voice, only to have my father pick up already halfway through a sentence to my mother about Jake's recruiting visit that weekend, saying, hang on, Elena's calling," in a tone that made it clear I was, in that moment, an interruption to something more pressing. I didn't tell him it was the night before my boards. Some tired, self-protective part of me had already decided it wouldn't change anything if I did. It was during my 3rd year of medical school, in the cardiology rotation that first made me fall in love with emergency medicine, that I met Marcus Alvarez. He wasn't a doctor. He worked in commercial real estate finance, structuring investment funds that bought and managed retail and mixed-use properties across the Southeast, an entire world of leases and cap rates and tenant improvement allowances that I understood almost nothing about the first year we dated, and came to understand quite a bit about later, for reasons that will matter enormously by the end of the story. We met at a mutual friend's dinner party, and what struck me first about him was how he listened, really listened, the whole way through a sentence before responding, the way almost nobody in my family ever had. We dated through the rest of medical school, and into my residency. He proposed on the rooftop of the building where his firm's very first investment property had been, which he told me later was his quiet way of saying he wanted our life together built on the same kind of patient, deliberate foundation he built everything else on. I called my parents that night. My mother's first question was whether Marcus had a stable job, and my father's first question, almost immediately after, was whether the wedding would conflict with Jake's upcoming pro day, which was tentatively scheduled for that same spring. It did not conflict, as it turned out, largely because I quietly checked the pro day schedule myself before setting a wedding date, a fact I never told either of them because some exhausted, self-protective part of me had already learned to plan my life around Jake's calendar before anyone could ask me to. My wedding, unlike some stories I know are close to many of your hearts watching tonight, my parents did actually attend.
I want to be fair about that.
But I remember, vividly, standing at the edge of my own reception, watching my father pull out his phone no fewer than 6 times during the toasts to check Jake's latest highlight reel from a scrimmage that had happened that same weekend, 300 miles away, footage Jake's college had posted online. My father wasn't cruel about it. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He simply couldn't help himself, the way an addict can't help checking for the next hit, and by that point in my life, I understood, with a kind of weary clarity, that Jake's football career had become something close to a genuine addiction for both my parents, not a source of pride so much as an organizing principle for their entire emotional lives. The final break came at my medical school graduation, the moment I described at the start of the story. I'd asked them, months in advance, circling the date on a calendar I mailed to their house myself, because I'd learned by then that verbal reminders alone rarely worked. They RSVP'd yes. And then, 2 weeks before graduation, a regional NFL scout called my father directly to invite Jake to a combined tryout, not a guaranteed roster spot, not even a draft promise, just a tryout, an opportunity, one of dozens Jake would have that year given his college performance. And my parents did not hesitate for a single moment before choosing it over the single most significant academic milestone of my entire life. I stood backstage that morning in my purple gown, reading that text message, and I felt the last of something in me finish breaking that had been cracking slowly for 26 years. I did not cry. I fixed my cap, found my place in line, and walked across that stage in front of 2,000 strangers and 18 empty guest seats near the front, 2 of which belonged to the people who had raised me. I remember the specific sound of my own name being read over the auditorium's sound system, Elena Marsh, Doctor of Medicine, and turning instinctively, out of 26 years of habit, toward the 4th row where those laminated seat cards sat clipped to empty chairs, before catching myself and turning instead toward Marcus and his parents, 3 rows back, all 3 of them on their feet, Dolores with both hands pressed to her mouth, Marcus's father filming on his phone with the shaking, unsteady focus of someone crying while trying to hold a camera still. I remember thinking, in the strange, suspended half-second it takes to walk across a stage, that I had spent my entire life quietly rehearsing this exact moment in my head with different people sitting in those seats, and that the version actually happening, empty chairs and all, was somehow both the saddest and the most honest thing that had ever happened to me, because for the first time, I wasn't performing for an audience that had never once fully shown up. I was simply being witnessed completely by the people who actually had. Marcus was there. His parents were there, having flown in from Georgia the day before, sitting in the row directly behind my empty parent seats, and afterward his mother, a warm, sharp-eyed woman named Dolores, hugged me so tightly I nearly lost my breath and said, "We are so unbelievably proud of you, Elena, today and every single day." And something about the plainness of that sentence, no qualifiers, no comparisons to anyone else's achievements, undid something in me that I'd been holding together with sheer stubbornness for over 2 decades. 2 weeks later, I called my parents and told them, calmly, that I needed distance from the family for a while. My mother cried and said I was punishing them for one bad scheduling conflict. My father said, "You've always made things bigger than they need to be, Elena." A sentence I noted, with something like grim, exhausted recognition, he had never once used about Jake missing my college graduation 4 years earlier for a summer camp invitational. I told them I loved them, and I meant it, the way you can love people and still refuse to keep bleeding quietly for them. And then I stopped answering their calls. 6 years passed. ##### part 3. Building a life that had nothing to prove. If you've ever gone no contact with family, you understand the first year is the hardest, and then something shifts, and the silence stops feeling like an open wound and starts feeling like solid ground. I finished residency, matched into an emergency medicine fellowship, and eventually took a position as an attending physician at a Level 1 trauma center in Knoxville. Marcus's real estate fund grew from 3 regional shopping centers into a portfolio spanning nearly 40 properties across 4 states, mixed-use retail, medical office buildings, and neighborhood strip centers, the unglamorous backbone of small-town commerce that most people never think twice about until the pharmacy or the dry cleaner they've used for years suddenly closes. I'd love to tell you I never thought about my family during those 6 years. That wouldn't be honest. I thought about them constantly in the particular way you think about a limb that's been amputated. The ache doesn't disappear just because the source is gone. It just relocates and you learn, slowly, to work around it. I built a life that had absolutely nothing to do with earning approval from Pinewood, Tennessee, and there were entire stretches, sometimes 6 or 8 months at a time, when I genuinely believed I'd made peace with never speaking to my parents again. Those 6 years held some of the hardest and most formative work of my entire career. Emergency medicine is not a specialty that leaves much room for self-pity. You learn very quickly that the person in front of you needs your full attention regardless of what you're carrying privately, and in a strange way, that discipline became its own kind of healing. I remember a particular overnight shift during my 2nd year as an attending, a mass casualty event from a highway pileup that brought in 11 patients within 40 minutes, and standing at the center of that chaos, directing triage, making split-second decisions that genuinely determined whether people lived or died, I felt something settle in me that had nothing to do with Pinewood at all. I was good at this. Not good in the quiet, unacknowledged way I'd been good at things as a child, waiting for someone to notice. Good in a way that saved an actual life that night, a 19-year-old college student with a collapsed lung who later sent the department a thank you card that I kept, for months, taped inside my locker. Marcus and I bought a house in Knoxville during my 3rd year as an attending, a modest brick colonial with a garden. Marcus's mother helped me plant the first spring we lived there, roses along the back fence that I still tend most Saturday mornings, a small, deliberate ritual that has nothing to do with performance and everything to do with simply liking the smell of dirt under my fingernails after a long week in a hospital that smells like antiseptic and adrenaline. We got a dog, a rescue mutt named Biscuit, who Marcus swore was part beagle, and I swore was part something entirely unidentifiable. We built, slowly and without any fanfare, the kind of ordinary, sturdy life that I don't think either of us had fully believed we deserved until we were actually living inside it. Jake, for what it's worth, never made an NFL roster. He went undrafted, spent one difficult season on a practice squad, got released, and eventually took a job selling commercial insurance back in Pinewood, a fact I learned secondhand years later from an old high school classmate I ran into at a conference, not from either of my parents directly, because by then we simply didn't talk. About 8 months ago, in a routine investor portfolio review at the fund Marcus co-managed, a junior analyst flagged a tenant in one of their smaller strip center properties, a 9-unit retail building on Route 9 outside Pinewood, Tennessee, as 90 days behind on rent and trending toward lease default. The tenant's business name was listed simply as Marsh's Family Trattoria. I found out because Marcus, without realizing the significance of the name at first, mentioned it to me over dinner as an odd little coincidence. "Same last name as you, funny," he said, scrolling through the report on his tablet, and I set my fork down very carefully and asked him to read me the full tenant address. 118, Route 9, Pinewood, Tennessee. My parents' restaurant. The one my father had opened 4 years after I stopped speaking to them, using, I would learn later, a home equity loan against the house I'd grown up in, chasing a dream he'd apparently always had of running a real family place, a dream he'd never once mentioned wanting during the 26 years I actually lived under his roof. Hashtag part 3.5. The patient who reminded me. I want to tell you about something that happened about a year before my father's phone call because I think it explains, better than almost anything else I could say, why I responded to that call the way I eventually did. I had a patient come through the trauma bay on a Sunday night, an elderly man named Harold, 78 years old, brought in after a fall at home. He was disoriented, frightened, and completely alone. His wife had passed 2 years earlier, and it took nearly 4 hours for anyone on staff to track down a family member, a daughter who lived out of state and hadn't spoken to him in almost as long as I hadn't spoken to my own parents. When she finally called the unit, I happened to be the one who picked up the phone, and I remember the particular exhaustion in her voice, the wariness, the way she asked, almost defensively before I'd said anything about his condition, "Is this going to be a whole thing? Because I have to warn you, we don't really talk." I told her, gently, that her father was stable, that he'd likely need a short hospital stay and some support arranging in-home care afterward, and that I wasn't calling to guilt her into anything, only to make sure she had accurate information to make her own decision. There was a long silence on the line, and then she said quietly, "Nobody's ever said it like that to me before. Usually people just assume I'm supposed to drop everything." She ended up flying in 2 days later, and I saw her sitting at his bedside during my next shift, holding his hand, both of them a little awkward and unpracticed at it, like two people relearning a language they used to speak fluently as children. I thought about that call constantly in the weeks after my own father reached out. I thought about how much of the anger I might have brought to that conversation with my own family had actually been metabolized slowly over years of standing at bedsides watching strangers navigate the exact fractures I recognized in my own life. I had learned professionally long before I ever had the chance to apply it personally that people rarely change because they're shamed into it. They change when they change at all because someone finally hands them accurate information and the dignity of a real choice, instead of either total rescue or total abandonment. I decided, somewhere in the weeks before my father's call, without fully realizing I was deciding it, that if this moment ever came for my own family, I wanted to be the version of myself that had shown up for Harold's daughter. Not soft. Not a pushover. Just honest and fair and willing to let people rise to meet real information instead of doing the rising for them. Hashtag part 4. The call. 3 weeks after that dinner conversation, my father called me for the first time in 6 years. I stared at the unfamiliar area code for a long moment before I recognized it as Pinewoods, and something in my chest did that same familiar pressure drop I remembered from graduation morning, except this time layered with 6 years of distance and, underneath that, a strange, cautious curiosity I hadn't expected to still feel. Elena. My father's voice sounded older, rougher around the edges than I remembered. "It's your dad." "I know, Dad." I kept my voice level. I'd had 6 years to practice level. "I know it's been a long time. I know we've got a lot to sort through, and I want to someday, I really do. But I need to ask you something first, and I know how that sounds, calling out of nowhere with an ask, but I didn't know who else to call." There it was. the exact shape of every conversation I'd ever had with him, an opening gesture toward reconnection that existed entirely as a doorway to the actual point. "What's going on?" I asked. The story unspoled slowly, with the particular halting shame of a proud man forced to describe his own failure out loud. He'd opened the restaurant using a home equity loan against the house, chasing that long-buried dream, and for the first 2 years it had done reasonably well, a modest local success, full on Friday and Saturday nights, the kind of place that got a nice write-up in the county paper. But a new highway bypass had rerouted traffic away from Route 9 18 months earlier. Foot traffic had dropped by nearly half, and between rising food costs and a rent increase built into their lease renewal, they'd fallen 3 months behind. The property management company had sent a formal default notice. Eviction proceedings, effectively a permanent closure of the only business he'd ever truly wanted to build, were scheduled to begin in 5 weeks unless they could bring the account current or negotiate new terms, and no bank would extend them further credit given the restaurant's thin financials. "We need about $60,000, Elena," my father said, his voice cracking in a way that, after 33 years of practice, I still couldn't fully tell was genuine grief or wounded pride dressed up as grief, which tells you something about the house I grew up in. "I hate asking. You know I hate asking. But you're doing well. I hear real well, and family's supposed to help family." I sat with that sentence for a long moment in my kitchen, with the exact portfolio report Marcus's analyst had flagged still saved in a folder on my own laptop 3 feet away, a report with my father's business listed on it as a tenant in default in a building I had, through my marriage, an indirect ownership stake in. "Family's supposed to help family," I repeated back to him quietly.
Yes.
"Exactly," he said, mistaking my flat tone for agreement, relief flooding his voice. "Did Jake offer to help?" I asked. A pause. A telling one. "Jake's got his own situation right now, Elena. Insurance commissions haven't been great this year, and with the new baby." "I don't know anything about a new baby," I said. "Because nobody in this family has spoken to me in 6 years, Dad. So I want to make sure I understand the actual rule here. Is it that family helps family, or is it that family helps Jake, and the rest of us help family?" My father was quiet for a long moment. "That's not fair, Elena. We're about to lose the restaurant." "I know," I said. "I've actually known for about 3 weeks." The silence that followed was the longest silence I've ever sat inside of on a phone call in my entire life. "What do you mean you've known?" my father finally asked, confusion sliding slowly toward something warier. "I need you to listen carefully, Dad, and I'm only going to walk through this once." I took a breath. My husband co-manages a commercial real estate investment fund. One of the properties in that fund is the strip center on Route 9. Your restaurant's lease default came across an internal portfolio report 3 weeks ago, completely by coincidence, because a junior analyst happened to mention the tenant name at dinner. I am not a property manager. I do not personally decide who gets evicted and who doesn't, and I would never abuse my husband's professional position to interfere in a business decision in a way that would compromise his fund's fiduciary obligations to its own investors. That's not what this phone call is going to be. But I can tell you, separately as your daughter, and as someone who happens to actually understand commercial lease law fairly well after 6 years married into this world, what your real options are. And none of them are call the daughter you never showed up for and hope guilt writes you a check. "Elena." "I'm not finished, Dad." Still level. Still calm. "I want you to notice, if you're listening tonight, that I never once raised my voice through this entire call. Calm, I've learned, holds more weight in a room than anger ever does. You have real options here. Most commercial landlords, including the fund managing your building, would far rather restructure a struggling long-term tenant's lease than go through the cost and vacancy risk of eviction, especially for a business with a decent operating history before the bypass changed your foot traffic. There are formal tenant workout processes for exactly this situation. Deferred back rent rolled into the remaining lease term, a temporary reduced rate tied to revenue recovery, sometimes even a modest tenant improvement contribution if the landlord believes in the business's long-term viability. "I am not going to hand you $60,000, because a check doesn't actually solve your underlying problem, which is that nobody in this restaurant ever built a real relationship with your landlord or your accountant, the same way nobody in this family ever built one with me until the exact week you needed something. What I am willing to do, entirely outside of any professional capacity, on my own time, because I am your daughter, and I do still care what happens to you, even after everything, is help you and mom understand exactly what to ask for and how to present it, so you walk into that negotiation informed instead of desperate. My father was crying now, quietly, the sound of it strange and unfamiliar to me, because I had never once heard him cry in 26 years of living in his house. "You've known this whole time," he said, "and you didn't call us." And there it was, even sitting inside a crisis they'd built themselves. The thing my father reached for first wasn't gratitude for the lifeline I was actually offering. It was hurt that I hadn't rescued them fast enough. "Dad," I said, and for the first time in the whole call, I let something into my voice beyond flat calm. Not anger, just plain truth. "I found out about your default notice from a spreadsheet at my husband's office. You found out I graduated medical school from a photo I posted online 3 weeks after it happened, because neither of you called to ask how the ceremony went. I think we're square on the not reaching out fast enough front." There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I genuinely wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I think about that day sometimes," he said. "The combine. Jake didn't even get a call back from it, you know. Nothing came of it. And I keep thinking, if I'd known that ahead of time, if I'd known it wasn't going to matter, I would have been in that auditorium instead. But I didn't know, and I chose it anyway, and I think that's the part that eats at me now. Not that Jake's tryout didn't pan out. That I didn't even hesitate before choosing it over you. I didn't have a ready response for that. Some part of me had spent 6 years imagining what an apology for my father might sound like, and I don't think I'd ever actually pictured one this specific, this quietly devastating in its honesty. I told him I needed some time to think about everything, both the restaurant situation and everything underneath it, and he said that was fair, that he understood, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I believed he actually meant it rather than simply saying what he thought would keep me on the phone. "Can I ask you something else?" he said, before we hung up. "Does Jake know you found out about the restaurant through Marcus's company? Does he know how close we actually came to losing it?" "I don't know what Jake knows," I said honestly. "That's not really something I control anymore, Dad. I stopped managing what this family does or doesn't know about me a long time ago. It was the only way I knew how to survive it." He was quiet again, and then he said, "That's fair. I earned that." We hung up shortly after, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time afterward, staring at the same portfolio report still open on my laptop, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel after that call. Not triumph, not vindication, just a tired, cautious kind of hope that maybe, for the first time in over 2 decades, my father had actually heard me. "Elena, I'm not finished, Dad." Still level, still calm. "I want you to notice, if you're listening tonight, that I never once raised my voice through this entire call. Calm, I've learned, holds more weight in a room than anger ever does. You have real options here. Most commercial landlords, including the fund managing your building, would far rather restructure a struggling long-term tenant's lease than go through the cost and vacancy risk of eviction, especially for a business with a decent operating history before the bypass changed your foot traffic. There are formal tenant workout processes for exactly this situation. Deferred back rent rolled into the remaining lease term, a temporary reduced rate tied to revenue recovery, sometimes even a modest tenant improvement contribution if the landlord believes in the business's long-term viability. I am not going to hand you $60,000 because a check doesn't actually solve your underlying problem, which is that nobody in this restaurant ever built a real relationship with your landlord or your accountant, the same way nobody in this family ever built one with me until the exact week you needed something. What I am willing to do, entirely outside of any professional capacity, on my own time, because I am your daughter and I do still care what happens to you, even after everything, is help you and mom understand exactly what to ask for and how to present it, so you walk into that negotiation informed instead of desperate. My father was crying now, quietly, the sound of it strange and unfamiliar to me, because I had never once heard him cry in 26 years of living in his house. "You've known this whole time," he said, "and you didn't call us." And there it was, even sitting inside a crisis they'd built themselves. The thing my father reached for first wasn't gratitude for the lifeline I was actually offering. It was hurt that I hadn't rescued them fast enough. "Dad," I said, and for the first time in the whole call, I let something into my voice beyond flat calm. Not anger, just plain truth. "I found out about your default notice from a spreadsheet at my husband's office. You found out I graduated medical school from a photo I posted online 3 weeks after it happened, because neither of you called to ask how the ceremony went. I think we're square on the not reaching out fast enough front." There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I genuinely wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I think about that day sometimes," he said. "The combine. Jake didn't even get a call back from it, you know. Nothing came of it. And I keep thinking, if I'd known that ahead of time, if I'd known it wasn't going to matter, I would have been in that auditorium instead. But I didn't know, and I chose it anyway, and I think that's the part that eats at me now. Not that Jake's tryout didn't pan out. That I didn't even hesitate before choosing it over you. I didn't have a ready response for that. Some part of me had spent 6 years imagining what an apology from my father might sound like, and I don't think I'd ever actually pictured one this specific, this quietly devastating in its honesty. I told him I needed some time to think about everything, both the restaurant situation and everything underneath it, and he said that was fair, that he understood, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I believed he actually meant it rather than simply saying what he thought would keep me on the phone. "Can I ask you something else?" he said, before we hung up. "Does Jake know you found out about the restaurant through Marcus's company? Does he know how close we actually came to losing it?" "I don't know what Jake knows," I said honestly. "That's not really something I control anymore, Dad. I stopped managing what this family does or doesn't know about me a long time ago. It was the only way I knew how to survive it." He was quiet again, and then he said, "That's fair. I earned that." We hung up shortly after, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time afterward, staring at the same portfolio report still open on my laptop, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel after that call. Not triumph, not vindication, just a tired, cautious kind of hope that maybe, for the first time in over 2 decades, my father had actually heard me. Hashtag part 5. What I actually did. I spent the 2 days after that call turning it over and over with Marcus at our kitchen table, the same table where, months earlier, he'd first mentioned a coincidental tenant name over dinner without either of us knowing what it would eventually mean. Part of me wanted to simply write the check, not because I owed my parents anything. I'd made a fragile kind of peace with that fact years earlier, but because there is a particular exhaustion that comes from being the capable one and choosing, deliberately, not to fix things you're fully able to fix. Marcus asked me the same question, almost word for word, that I imagine gets asked in a lot of kitchens in stories like this one. If you wire them $60,000 tomorrow, what actually changes? Does your dad start calling to ask how your shifts are going? Does your mom remember your birthday without help from a calendar reminder? Or does this just become the new floor, the thing you're quietly on the hook for from now on, the same way you've always been on the hook for everything except celebration? I hated that he was right. I told him so. He made me tea and let me sit with it, the way he always has, patient in a way my own family never learned to be. So here is what I actually did. I called the fund's asset manager overseeing the Route 9 property, not to pull strings, but to confirm, in general terms applicable to any tenant, what the standard workout process looked like for a small business with a solid multi-year history before an external shock like a highway rerouting. Then I called my parents back 4 days later and told them I would sit with them, over video call, and help them prepare a proper written proposal. 18 months of back rent rolled into a modest extension of the lease term, a temporary 10% rent reduction for the following year while they rebuilt marketing around the new traffic patterns, and a commitment, on their end, to bring in a part-time bookkeeper instead of continuing to run the restaurant's finances out of a shoebox of receipts, which was, I learned during that first call, precisely how they'd been operating the entire time. It took 5 weeks and 3 video calls, each around 2 hours long, during which I watched my father, a man who had never once in my childhood asked me for help with anything, slowly learn to say, "I don't fully understand this clause, can you explain it again?" to the daughter he used to accuse of making things bigger than they need to be. I watched my mother, midway through the second call, quietly admit that some part of her had always known Jake's football career had swallowed up more of the family's attention than was fair, and that she didn't know how to have said so at the time, because it just felt like the exciting thing happening, and yours felt like it was always going to be fine without us. I did not respond to that the way some version of me, 10 years earlier, might have wanted to, with every buried moment I'd cataloged since I was 13 years old. I simply said, "It wasn't always going to be fine without you, Mom. It was fine because I made it fine on my own, without any other choice." She was quiet for a long time after that. I think, for the first time in either of our lives, she actually heard it. I remember one moment from the second call especially clearly. My father had the restaurant shoebox of receipts spread across the kitchen table where I used to do my homework as a kid, sorting through crumpled paper with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and at one point, he looked directly into the camera and said, quietly, almost like he didn't mean for it to come out loud, "I don't know how to do any of this, Elena. I never learned how to do any of this the right way." There was something in his face in that moment I had genuinely never seen before in 33 years. Not the confident, sideline-pacing father I remembered from Jake's games, but a tired 61-year-old man who had built an entire identity around being the one who knew what to do, discovering, late in life, how much he actually hadn't known. I didn't say anything comforting. I just said, "Okay, let's go through it together, one page at a time," and we did, for almost 2 hours. While my mother sat beside him refilling his coffee and occasionally reaching over to squeeze his shoulder in a way I don't remember ever seeing her do when I was a kid. The proposal was submitted, reviewed by the fund's asset management team through the standard process available to any tenant in that position, and approved. My parents' restaurant did not close. Their monthly obligation dropped enough, combined with the deferred back rent, to give them real breathing room, and I never once had to write a check or ask my husband to bend a single rule on their behalf. Hashtag part 6. The call I didn't expect. About 3 weeks into that process, Jake called me for the first time in 6 years. I almost didn't recognize the number, an area code I'd deleted from my phone somewhere around year 2 of the silence, back when I'd still been trying to convince myself that deleting a contact made a family easier to let go of. "Elena."
Hey.
"It's me." His voice sounded exactly like it had at 22, easy and a little too casual, the voice of someone who had spent his whole life assuming rooms would generally go his way. "Hi, Jake. So, Dad told me you're helping with the restaurant stuff. That's really cool of you." A pause, the exact shape of a pause I'd grown up hearing from both our parents, right before an ask. "Hey, so, random, but since you're kind of in the loop with commercial real estate stuff now through Marcus, Sarah and I have been looking at office space for an insurance branch I want to open up, and financing's been rough. You think you guys could maybe put in a word, help us get a better rate on the lease or something?" I sat with that for a moment, absorbing the fact that 6 years of silence, one missed medical school graduation, and a genuine family financial crisis had produced, from my brother, not one question about how I was actually doing, not a single acknowledgement of the years of quiet between us, only a new request stacked neatly on top of the old pattern. "Jake," I said, "I'm going to be honest, and I need you to actually hear it instead of just waiting for your turn to respond. What I did for Mom and Dad wasn't pulling strings. It was helping them understand a standard process that exists for any struggling tenant, information I happen to have because of my own marriage, not a favor I'm handing out. If you and Sarah need help with a lease, I can point you toward the same kind of information, how tenant negotiations generally work, what to ask a landlord for. That's what I have to give. It isn't a favor system, and it never was, even growing up, even when it felt to you like it was." He didn't have much to say after that. We hung up a few minutes later, neither of us cruel, both of us a little raw. I sat with it afterward and felt something closer to sadness than anger, the understanding that Jake had simply never been taught any way to reach for family besides asking, because asking had always worked for him, and nobody had ever modeled anything different, for either of us. Hashtag part 7. What came after? 6 months after that first phone call, my father called again, called, not texted, which in my family you now understand means something, to tell me the restaurant had made it through its first profitable quarter since the bypass opened, largely because they'd finally hired that part-time bookkeeper and started actually tracking their margins instead of guessing at them. He asked, hesitantly, whether I'd consider coming to Pinewood for a visit. Not a family gathering with Jake and Sarah and the baby. Just the two of them, at the kitchen table in the house I grew up in, the house whose equity had built a restaurant that nearly went under and, through a strange and unplanned turn, had been saved by the daughter that house had never once made feel like the important one. I said yes. I brought Marcus. My father, a man who had never once in 33 years said the words, "I'm proud of you," to me directly, stood in the driveway when we pulled in, looked at the two of us getting out of the car, and said, quietly, testing the words the way you test a floorboard you're not sure will hold your weight, "You built something real, Elena." I should have said that a long time ago. About all of it, not just this. We spent that afternoon at the kitchen table where I used to hide my report cards, and for the first time in my adult life, my mother asked me actual questions about my work, not polite, glancing questions asked on the way to a subject about Jake, but real ones, about what a trauma shift actually felt like, whether I ever got scared, how I learned to keep my hands steady when a room full of people were looking to me for answers. I answered honestly, and watched her listen the whole way through, without once glancing at her phone or steering the conversation elsewhere, and something in me that had been braced for disappointment for over 3 decades slowly, cautiously, began to loosen. Before we left that evening, my mother walked me out to the car alone, without Marcus or my father, and stood there for a moment in the driveway in the fading light, twisting her hands the way she used to when she was working up to something difficult. "I used to tell myself you didn't need us as much," she finally said, "because you never seemed to. You were always so capable, even as a little girl, and Jake needed so much more hand-holding, and I told myself that meant you were fine. I don't think I ever really asked myself whether you were fine, or whether you just learned to look that way because nobody was checking." I didn't have a perfect response for that. I just hugged her, and let it be enough for that evening that she'd finally said it out loud. I did not cry in front of him. I saved that for the drive home, somewhere past the Tennessee state line, Marcus's hand resting quietly on my knee, not saying a word, just letting me have it. Part 8. What this wasn't. I want to be honest about what this story is not, because I think that matters more than a tidy ending. This was not a revenge story where I watched my family's world collapse from a place of satisfaction. I never wanted that, not even during the years I might have had every reason to. This was not a story where money healed 26 years of feeling like a footnote. It didn't, and I don't think it fully ever will. And I've made a kind of peace with the fact that some of what I carry from that house is simply mine to carry now, quietly, the way you carry an old ache that flares on certain nights but doesn't stop you from getting up the next morning and going back to work. I think a lot of people who've lived some version of this story want there to be a single dramatic moment where the scales finally balance, a courtroom, a boardroom, a gasp from across a table. My story didn't have one of those, and I've come to believe that's actually the more honest version of how healing tends to work. It happened in small, unglamorous increments, a video call where my father admitted he didn't understand a lease clause. A driveway conversation that took 33 years to arrive at 4 sentences. A phone call with my mother where she finally asked me a real question about my work and then, for once, actually waited for the answer. None of it undid the empty chairs. All of it, slowly, started to matter more than the empty chairs ever had. I also want to say something for anyone listening who is currently the reliable one in their own family, the one everyone assumes is fine, because you've never given them a reason to think otherwise. Being capable is not the same as being cared for. You are allowed to notice the difference. You are allowed to build an entire life that has nothing to prove to the people who overlooked you, and you are also allowed, if the moment ever comes, to offer them help on your own terms rather than either total rescue or total silence. Both of those responses are valid. Neither one makes you smaller. The only thing that matters is that the choice, whichever one you make, actually belongs to you. What this was a moment where the family that had never once shown up for me needed something only I happened to be positioned to help with, and I got to choose clearly and completely exactly what kind of help that would be. Not a rescue. Not a reward for finally being seen. Just fair, informed, competent help. The same help I would have offered any stranger, delivered with the boundaries a stranger would never have needed from me, because a stranger never once left 2 chairs empty at the most important morning of my life. Jake and I are polite now. Distant, but polite. Both of us aware of a gap neither of us has quite figured out how to name yet. My parents and I talk most weeks. It is not the relationship 8-year-old me imagined, watching a passing net go up in the backyard that summer, wishing someone would build something just as carefully for the thing I loved. But it's real and it's honest, and it's built on something sturdier than performance now, and in the end, I think that's worth more than any amount of money my father could ever have paid back. I still think, sometimes, about that portfolio report, about the moment Marcus read the tenant name off his tablet at dinner, and I set my fork down very carefully, holding a piece of information that could have let me simply say nothing at all, let the eviction happen, and call it even after 6 years of silence. I think about how easy that would have been, and how doing something instead, on my own terms, with my own boundaries fully intact, turned out to be the harder and, in the end, the far more powerful choice. I've thought a lot in the months since about why I didn't simply write the check. It would have been easier in some ways. It would have ended the awkward calls faster. It would have handed my mother the version of this story she could tell at church, the version where I came through for the family, the kind of story that would have let her avoid the harder truth underneath it, which is that the crisis was never really about $60,000. It was about 26 years of a household that never learned to ask each other for help without it being tangled up in who had earned the right to be helped and who hadn't. A check would have been the easy ending. It would not have been the true one. What I gave them instead cost me more, honestly. More hours on video calls walking my father through lease language while he muttered about lawyer talk that wasn't actually lawyer talk at all. More emotional labor sitting with my mother's half-formed apology without rushing to either fix it or walk away from it. But it also asked something of them money never could have. It asked them to actually participate in their own recovery. To sit across a screen from the daughter they'd spent 2.5 decades treating as the reliable one, the fine one, the one who didn't need watching, and let her teach them something for once. To say, out loud, across 3 different calls, "I don't understand this, can you explain it again?" to the one person in the family they had always assumed had nothing left to explain to them. I didn't need to watch them lose that restaurant to know my own worth. I'd known it since I was 22 years old, walking a hospital hallway during my first overnight rotation, catching my own reflection in a dark window and thinking, for the first time in my life, I did this. Nobody had to be watching for it to be real. But there is a difference between knowing your worth privately for yourself and getting the rare chance to hold it out into the open in front of the very people who taught you to doubt it and choosing, calmly, exactly how much of yourself you're willing to give. That choice, not the lease negotiation, not even the driveway conversation that came after, that was the real ending to the story. Everything else was simply what happened once I finally let myself believe I was allowed to make it. That's the whole story. Thank you for staying with me through it. If any part of this reminded you of your own empty chair, your own sibling who got the spotlight, your own late-night phone call from a parent who never quite says the right thing first, I hope you know it took me over 3 decades to learn. The people who overlook you don't get the final say on what you're worth.
You get to decide that.
Quietly and entirely on your own terms. If you made it this far, tell me in the comments, would you have made the same call I did? Or would you have walked away for good? I read every single one. And I'll see you in the next story.